right, everyone. Good evening and welcome to tonight's program. My name is Victoria Williams. I'm a program officer at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Welcome to tonight's program called The New Rules of War. It's a pleasure to welcome Sean McFate to the council. His new book, The New Rules of War, Victory in the Age of Durable Disorder, will be available for sale and signing after the program, just right over there. Please note that we are on the record and that we are live streaming this event. We always welcome your social media engagement, but please silence your phones. Note that the council is an independent and nonpartisan platform, and views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the council. This program is part of the Lester Crown Center on U.S. Foreign Policy. A generous gift from the Crown family supports all of the center's efforts in development of digital resources to make the council's foreign policy content more accessible and across all platforms. We want to thank all of our members that are in attendance today. Your support is critical to our work, and if you are not yet a member, we just encourage you to join us, and there's a wide range of levels for you to choose from. Tonight's conversation will be followed by audience Q&A, and we will be taking questions from in the room and from online. You can submit your questions online by just opening up your browser, typing in chi.cnf.io, and we'll be taking those questions from there. But now I'd like to introduce our distinguished speaker, Sean McFate. He's a professor of strategy at the National Defense University, as well as Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Additionally, he's an advisor to Oxford University Center for Technology and Global Affairs. Sean began his career as a paratrooper in the U.S. Army's 82nd Airborne Division and then worked for a major private military corporation where he ran operations there. Sean is also the author of several books and speaks frequently on military and security matters. I will return to moderate audience Q&A, but please join me in welcoming Sean McFate.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming out and being stalwart in this snowy weather. I am from Washington, where a snowflake shuts down the government. They don't have snowplows there. So thank you very much. I want to talk tonight about war and warfare and how it's changing, how we're not prepared for it, and what we need to do to become prepared for it. It's not a topic we're used to thinking about because we are, at least at the moment, the world's superpower whose military is unchallenged, yet we find challenges everywhere. So I wrote this book as some background because I was angry. I was angry because I had lost friends in Iraq and Afghanistan. Some of you may have as well. As a taxpayer, I was angry that seems that we were flushing trillions of dollars down the toilet in places that didn't seem to want our assistance much. And I was angry that our national image was being tarnished by low-level foes. All the while, we were achieving very little on the ground. And this made me frustrated. The problem is that we have the best military. We have the best troops, the best training, the best equipment, the best technology, the most money. We spend more money on the Department of Defense than the next 8 biggest countries combined. So the question is, what's the problem, right? What's the problem? And this is not just a US problem, but the West. Has the West forgotten how to win wars? The last time the West decisively won a war was in 1945, and the world ran on vacuum tubes. And by the West, I'm using that word very loosely. I'm thinking sort of NATO-type forces. The implications of this are terrifying. If the West no longer knows how to win wars, if the US no longer knows how to win wars, what does the future hold for everybody, for the world? So that's what I set out to do. This was the puzzle of the book. The answer, just quickly, is that war has moved on, and we have to move on too, as well. Our enemies, everybody, it seems, except for us, grasp this. Everybody grasps this. And then we wonder why we struggle, because we're playing under an older set of rules for war. Here's an example, torn from the headlines of today, Venezuela, right? Venezuela, once the richest country in Latin America, is pulling a full tilt Somalia. It's a human tragedy. As you all know, we have two presidents there, right? One is backed by the people and backed by the United States and much of Latin America and much of the EU, pro-democracies. And the other, Maduro, is backed by the military and by China, Russia, and Turkey, autocracies. Seems like we have an ideological war in our midst, but that's not what I'm here to talk about tonight with Venezuela. Did you know about 2 weeks ago, Russian mercenaries secretly appeared in Venezuela? And these are not just any Russian mercenaries. And I say Russian mercenaries, this is a group called the Wagner Group. It's a company. It works for the GRU, which is their military intelligence, and they're mercenaries. We don't know, the top level leadership is all Russian, but the ranks they're mercenaries. They're from all over the place. They're from all over the place. And they, just to give you an idea of what they are, these are not lone riflemen in the Congo, the Kalashnikovs. They're not the villains of Hollywood. They are highly effective killers. A year ago, they almost took out some of our best troops in Syria. 500 Wagner Group mercenaries attacked an outpost in eastern Syria. These weren't just normal soldiers, this was Delta Force, Rangers, Green Berets, Marines, and there's a Kurdish militia. And when the 500 mercenaries attacked, they attacked with tanks, artillery, armored personnel carriers. And our troops, our best troops called in our best air support, B-52s, F-15s, AC-130 gunships, Apache helicopters, drone strike ships. And it still took our best troops with our best aviation 4 hours to beat back 500 mercenaries. 4 hours. What happens when they have to face 5,000 mercenaries? Even an undefeated military can lose. That's who's in Venezuela right now, and what they're doing, we do not know. Now, I know there are rumors of them going into, you've been in Syria and Ukraine, kneecapping militia who were supposed to be pro-Russian militia, and they were starting to waver. They kill the leaders to get them back in line, to apply discipline. So perhaps that's what they're doing with the Venezuelan army, sort of striking fear into them. But this is an example of the new rules of war. Mercenaries. You don't use your own forces, you use others, and we'll talk about that. War has moved on, we have to move on with it. So if I was to ask you what the biggest threats facing us today are, we could all spend the whole evening listing out the panoply of horrors. Some think it's China, others think it's Russia. We can make a case for Iran. We can keep on going, drug lords and terrorists, you name it, right? Genocide, climate change. The biggest threat, though, even though these are bad, leaving climate change out of it, the biggest threat is not actors. The biggest threat is systemic. It's something I call durable disorder. And what durable disorder is, it's the vacuum as states retreat, as the Westphalian system of states is retreating around the world. What's left in their wake is durable disorder. It's not anarchy. It's not the sky is falling, we have to invest in more sky. But it is more organic and wild than the world that we were taught in 6th grade social studies. Of the 190-some states in the world, only about 25 or 30 are considered strong. This is an order that can contain problems but not solve them. It is not anarchy, but it's marked by persistent, never-ending conflict and entropy, right? Forever wars is what we call them colloquially. And it is a systemic threat. It's systemic that gives rise to these other threats. It is also not new. It is not new. So we all remember somewhere, I hope, reading Machiavelli, The Prince. This is the world he was talking about. Northern Italy during the Renaissance and early Renaissance and Middle Ages was durable disorder. full of mercenaries and full of anybody who had enough money could buy armies and wage war for any reason they want, no matter how petty. War was everywhere all the time. Even popes had armies that they hired. And this is what he was lamenting in his books, The Prince, Discourses on Livy, The Art of War, etc. He saw it turn populations into sheep, basically. And this is the Italian Wars, which looks like sort of Afghanistan or the Middle East today. The truth is that world history is really disorder. It's not, we always think of like order, the world order being about states and their national militaries. That's anomalous, and it's only about 200 or 300 or 400 years old. Most of history looks like this. And we're just going back to the status quo ante of what history was before, which may also be a fiction of our imagination in terms of how ordered the world really was. So here are some signs of durable disorder today. Half of all peace treaties fail within 5 years. The majority of the world's states are facing some form of conflict. Conflicts have doubled since World War II. No matter what data set you look at, we can question the data sets, but violence has been an upswing. It's not the Fukuyama eternal democracy moment that was predicted for the end of history. We are seeing forever wars. When I talk to young people, that's what they think that wars become permanently. It doesn't have to be that way. This book is about that. So this is all, and we're seeing the return of mercenaries as well, who like to create wars or elongate wars for profit. This is durable disorder. The rules-based order is retreating. Now, those who grasp this, who grasp durable disorder, will prevail because they can exploit it, like China, Russia, terrorists, others, all the panoply we discussed. Those who do not will become exploited. And this is what concerns me about what we talk about today. Much of US foreign policy is Humpty Dumpty. We're trying to recreate the international liberal order as we imagine it. Whether that is real or fiction is one of some debate. But US national security strategy, fundamentally, from administration to administration, tries to do just this: relive and bring back the glory days. But it's too late. We've been strategically adrift since the Cold War, and in that time, durable disorder has set back in again. So we have a new kind of world order, durable disorder, and it begets a new type of warfare. A new type of warfare, and that's what we're not grasping. So the National Defense Strategy of last year, 2018, the Pentagon issued new guidance as to what we need to think about our future and how to defend ourselves. They shifted away from counterinsurgency and counterterrorism to bigger near-peer threats like Russia and China specifically. But why does everybody who thinks that there's going to be a war with Russia and China, why does everybody think it's going to be a conventional war? Conventional war is, like, let's think of World War I, World War II. It's the warfare of Westphalia. It's the warfare of Clausewitz. It's the warfare of big, industrialized national militaries hitting each other, just like, the Battle of the Bulge or perhaps the Fulda Gap in World War III, if we ever had a World War III in the 80s, for example. But that doesn't exist anymore. Nobody fights this way. Nobody fights this way at all. Data shows clearly that there's nothing more unconventional today than a conventional war. One question is, are we already at war with Russia and China? And Russia and China are trying to deliberately keep us from understanding that as part of the strategy. So what does war look like under durable disorder? Well, war is getting sneakier. It's not conventional. It's not going to be tank on tank, aircraft carrier and aircraft carrier. Don't expect the Battle of Midway with F-35s. It's going underground. It's going into the shadows. So for example, look at what Russia did to take the Crimea. They had the military strength to blitzkrieg through eastern Ukraine and seize the Crimea. But they chose not to do that. They used covert means instead. They used Spetsnaz, which is their special forces, mercenaries, proxy militia, little green men, and a lot of information warfare. And it's a brilliant strategy because we live in a global information era where plausible deniability is now more powerful than firepower. How can the world rally a defense for Crimea when the basic facts around the conflict are in question? By the time the West and others were bickering about what's really going on in Ukraine, Crimea was already a fait accompli. And that's how they took Crimea. How about the South China Sea? In the old rules of war, we think of there's war or peace. We think of war and peace like pregnancy. You either are or you're not, right? And that peace, well, war is the failure of peace. But in truth, there's no such thing as war or peace. There's only war and peace in the new rules of war. And China exploits this for victory. What they do in the South China Sea is they do things that go right up to the brink of war, and then they stop. When we're about to sort of freak out, they stop. But they keep everything they capture. And that's how they're winning the South China Sea, one island and one ally at the time. And it has nothing to do with aircraft groups or anything like that. They're being strategically cunning. They're being sneaky about it. Meanwhile, we're preparing for, again, Midway with better technology. Or how about this? Mercenaries are everywhere nowadays. 25 years ago, this would have been anathema to think about. But we have seen mercenary activity and organized ones like the Wagner Group in Ukraine, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Nigeria, Somalia, the Congo, now Venezuela. Mercenaries are returning, but always in the shadow. This is a picture of ex-SEALs and ex-Special Forces, Americans, our elite soldiers, who are mercenaries now in Yemen acting as kill squads for a Middle Eastern monarchy. Mercenaries are a big thing now, and it's deliberately kept under radar so that people don't see it. It's sneaky. So in the future, victory will go to the cunning and not the strong. But this is not our strategic culture. We're still thinking about kinetic force as being more important than cunning. That is part of our problem. So durable disorder is the new environment for war. Our problem is that we are not set up to fight in this environment. Our habits, our bureaucracy, our force structure, our training, our strategic culture is all still essentially World War II. It's conventional war. And then we wonder why we struggle in Afghanistan, Iraq, everywhere in the world. The world has moved on with its warfare. We have not, despite our overwhelming power. This is what I call strategic atrophy. And this doesn't, amongst the top ranks of our national security establishment, I'm talking about, top generals, but politicians, policymakers, that whole strata, we have, frankly, a low strategic IQ. And that's why we're struggling. We have the best military, the best troops, the best resources, the best of everything. What we are not doing is we're not applying it correctly to achieve our national interests. We have strategic atrophy. We're still mired in the past. So for example, here is war as we imagine it. Maybe not you, but if you go to a think tank event in Washington or something like that, this is what it looks like. Robots, right? Forget D-Day, when that landing craft hits the beach, robots are gonna come out and gonna take, but that's not how war is fought. It's not gonna be robots. Or they have some sort of thing that looks like this. Now you think you're looking at a video game called Call of Duty. It's not. This is what DARPA is trying to develop. But these are all tactical solutions, but war, as we know, is not won tactically, it's won at the strategic level. We learned that in Vietnam, right? You can win every tactical engagement, every battle, but yet lose the war. But here we're investing, we're doubling down on conventional weapons with better technology. It's the very definition of insanity. For 70 years, one thing has been very clear in warfare is that technology does not matter. Luddites, technological primitives, have routinely beaten advanced technological militaries. France in Algeria or Indochina, British in Palestine and Cyprus, the Soviets in Afghanistan, the US in Vietnam, Iraq and Afghanistan, the UN as well, around the world. So why are we investing more in conventional war and technology? It seems to be idiotic. This is one of the chief culprits, the F-35 fighter jet. This plane has cost American taxpayers $1.5 trillion. Trillion. That is more than Russia's GDP on a fighter airplane. On the whole program, not this single airplane. That would be really outrageous. Wow, they should work for Lockheed. Anyway, but the point is that $1.5 trillion. But when was the last time we had a strategic dogfight? Maybe the Korean War, right? Are fighter airplanes even relevant anymore? And in 2 long wars, how many combat missions has this fighter airplane flown? Does anybody know? Zero. The measurement of any weapon is its utility. Okay, 0 combat missions. Now recently, the Pentagon or Lockheed said, oh, this looks really bad for our PR, so we're gonna fly a few combat missions in Afghanistan, which they did in October or November, but it doesn't really count as combat if the enemy can't shoot back. So we're gonna count those. It costs, anyone take a guess of how much it costs to fly this thing per hour? $45,000 an hour. You're gonna say that? Yeah. $45,000. That's like more than the private first-class mechanic annual salary, right? So, you know, something could be wrong here, is my point. Something could be wrong. Meanwhile, it's not deterring China or Russia. It's not deterring anybody. So why are we buying more of them? So here is actually war as it is. War as it is. Russia. Manipulating elections, not just here, but the Brexit and elections across Europe. We all know that they tried to manipulate elections. The only question is, how effective were they? Was it a trifling? Did it throw an election? You know, Brexit and the US election were kind of close. That remains to be seen. I have no insight into that. But we do know that they're actively trying to manipulate elections. And it makes sense strategically. Why do you care about the sword when you can manipulate the arm that wields it? That's the strategic logic. They're also using conventional weapons, but in unconventional ways. So old rules versus new rules. This is an example. The Soviets always wanted to disunite Europe, and especially NATO. Right? So in the old rules, what they would do in like the 80s or 70s, they would have these massive military exercises on the border of East and West Germany. They'd have 150,000 Soviet soldiers, planes, everything. And they'd tell NATO, don't worry, don't freak out, it's just an exercise. And then NATO would be freaking out, because how do you know? How do you know if it's an exercise? And this would create fissures within NATO. Well, now, when the Kremlin wants to disunite Europe, it doesn't do that anymore. The utility of force in modern war is declining. What that means is the utility of force means the usefulness of force. It's being replaced by other things, sneakier things, like we saw covert units in Ukraine. Here they're using bombers in Syria, but not to destroy military targets. They're bombing civilian centers. They are creating a tidal wave of refugees that crashes upon the shores of the EU and results in the Brexit and the rise of right-wing parties, which they then pump up. Russia is weaponizing refugees. We're stuck thinking about who has the better missile system, and they're weaponizing refugees. That's the new rules of war. How about this? When was the last time you saw China as a villain in a movie? Anybody know? 10 years ago, which movie? Oh, yeah, Richard Gere got PNG'd from Hollywood. They tried to make Red Dawn 2, and that failed. You remember the story? They're like everybody remembers Red Dawn, right? A classic Patrick Swayze, classic, loosely used. Yeah, Wolverine. So somebody over here is the great American insurgency against the Soviet occupation in the 1980s. Well, they made a remake of this, I don't know, 10 years ago, with the Chinese. But then they had to go back and like Photoshop all the Chinese and turn it into North Korea, which is, of course, totally implausible. But the reason is that China has bought Hollywood. Talk about strategic messaging. You cannot make a bad movie about China. They can shape the way the world views them through the world's largest megaphone, which is Hollywood. That is the new rules of war. Victory and defeat it's won in the information space, not on the battlefield. In fact, battlefield victory is obsolete. Obsolete. You know, we're looking for a USS Missouri moment with the Taliban right now. The USS Missouri, as you recall, is the battleship that Japan signed surrender in World War II. There's no such thing as a USS Missouri moment with modern foes. So that's the new ways of war. War has moved on. We have to move on as well, because even an undefeated military can lose. Rome thought itself the eternal city until it wasn't. In 410 AD, when barbarians stormed and raided the city, and the 5th century was very ugly for them. So the point of this book and why I wrote it is that we have to learn how to win in this new environment of durable disorder. It requires a new set of rules to fight by. These rules will make the traditional warrior's head explode. It's not our paradigm of warfare is still essentially the glory days of World War II, and that is what's holding us back. We are our own worst enemy. Here are 10 rules for which to combat and win warfare in the future. And they do not look like strategic rules that are currently thought about or talked about in the Pentagon or elsewhere. And with this, I'd like to turn it over to audience Q&A.
Thank you so much for that. Like I said earlier, we're going to take questions from in the room and from online, and you can also vote for questions online if you'd like one of them. All right, we'll take a question just right here up to the front. Wait for the microphone, please. Thank you.
Thanks. So how much, you talked at the start about kind of the decline of the West and the liberal order. How much of the transition in warfare do you think is a reaction to the strength of the U.S. and the system over time, and that as kind of that declines, we'll be shifting back, you think, towards a more conventional form?
So that's a good question. I get this question all the time. It's basically, has the world adopted unconventional warfare because our conventional capabilities are so strong? And to some extent, yes. But I would say that, first of all, we have to break this paradigm of there's conventional versus unconventional warfare. It's kind of curious that we use normative language to describe war. Regular war, conventional war. We all agree what that looks like, but nobody can agree what unconventional war looks like, except it doesn't look like that, right? So if you study war, there's really no such thing as conventional war as we imagine it. It's sort of, it's a norm we have absorbed. So I think to some extent that is, I don't think that is like, it's suddenly if we stop building, conventional weapons, Russia's gonna do it. I think that warfare, we live in a global information age where being sneaky, avoiding cameras, being able to have plausible deniability is still more powerful than genocide. And genocide, by the way, is partly how the West was settled by the US Army. So I think that we can, and also just to be clear, I'm not saying we should stop building conventional weapons, but let's slow down the pace and invest money elsewhere. Because the State Department, other places are dying on the vine, and we need to, and they also help in modern war. But it's a very good question. It's very astute. Yeah.
We'll take a question from in the back, lady in the green coat.
Thank you. I know you're writing about traditional rules of war and warfare, but something we talk a lot about in my work, thinking about the military and then veterans, is the future force. And as that being one of our biggest national security issues is the people that are actually serving and not wanting to join. So could you reflect on that and kind of how it plays out in the world of modern warfare?
So is your question, how do we get more people to volunteer to serve?
Or people talking about the impact that that's actually going to have on our rules of war and how we're moving
It's a good
forward?
question. So it's actually quite a complex question. So my military mentor, I was a paratrooper in the 82nd. I had the great benefit and fortune of having Stan McChrystal as my battalion commander as when I was a lieutenant. This is a long time ago. And he did me the great honor of writing the foreword. He believes strongly, as do I, in national service. And it doesn't have to be military, it could be civilian. And it would solve, there's a lot of reasons why people may not like it, but it would also solve a lot of problems. But right now, one of the things, when I'm at National Defense University, which is a war college, it's very clear to vets that they are doing most of the bleeding for this country. Less than 1% of America serves in the military. And they are frankly tired of literally taking the hits. They will always serve and they always do their duty. It's not a question of that. But there is a growing problem. And the solution has been to use contractors. So during the Iraq and Afghanistan war, we'll put it this way. In World War II, only 10% of our force was contracted. In Iraq, it was 50%. And in Afghanistan, it was 70%. And when I talk to foreign journalists, they're like, well, it's going to be 90% in the future. And now we have Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, is pitching 100%. He's pitching a plan to replace all troops in Afghanistan with mercenaries to President Trump. And he's pitching this on simple solution to complex problem and price point. So that might happen. The reason I think we're partly involved in this is because we don't have enough Americans who serve. And because we don't have enough Americans that serve, we can be very bellicose as a nation because we don't actually have to bleed for our wars. And so that is my other concern. I wish we had more people who did serve because I think we'd be a little bit more taciturn about foreign entanglements.
I think as an extension to the point that you mentioned earlier, there's a question that came in from online is how are mercenaries legally allowed and are there any international conventions or national laws that prohibit their activities?
So it's a great question. So in this book, I do discuss the rise of mercenaries, which I think is one of the biggest destabilizing trends in the 21st century that's almost never covered. Forget ISIS, forget Russia, it's like the privatization of warfare. Because when you privatize war, it changes warfare because military strategies suddenly blend with market ones. And in some ways, we have CEOs that might be better prepared for the future war than four-star generals. There is no real legal framework to deal with mercenaries, either domestically or internationally. And worse, there's no political will. So who's going to go into Yemen and arrest all those mercenaries? It's not going to be United Nations or or the Marine Corps. And also, let's not forget that mercenaries can shoot your law enforcement dead. Okay? This is the one market. The market for force is the one market you cannot regulate, which means we can't stop it. This is what Machiavelli was complaining about in the 1520s. How it disappeared after the 30 Years' War is a great debate, and it didn't really go underground until 1850, but we can't probably recreate that situation, and we can't forget that mercenaries are the second oldest profession. They've been around for a very long time, and they're now back with us. So I'm kind of pessimistic about the utility of law to regulate this type of warfare.
Great. Take a question just right here from the gentleman in the scarf.
So two questions, if I may. The first, I confess I don't know when your book came out, but I would like to know whether there's been any reaction, whether it's the Pentagon,
Yes.
politicians or so on, that would react to what you're suggesting.
Yeah.
And then the second question, I get what you're saying about what we're not doing, but don't remember hearing anything you said about specifics that we should be doing.
Okay, great, good questions. So to answer the book came out January 22nd, so just a few weeks ago. It's gotten 2 sets of very strong reactions. Combat vets and younger people generally love the book because they're like, yeah, this is what is going on. A lot of older retired colonels and generals and Lockheed Martin folks hate the book, saying, oh, you're dangerously naive and blah, blah, blah. And so there's a generational rift. That's not universal, I mean, across the board, but generally speaking, that's how it's shaking out, which is what I expected when I wrote the book. This book asks tough questions and questions that are overdue, and we need to have a national discourse about forever wars. Otherwise, we'll be doomed to them forever, and that's a choice. We do have an option here. Okay, so in the 10 rules, as you can see, rules 1 through 4 are about what we need to stop doing, breaking bad habits. Rules 5 through 10 are about what we need to start doing. And they propose specific things. So for example, I talk about shadow wars. War is getting sneakier, it's going underground. We're building aircraft carriers, the enemy is doing these sneaky things that are much more potent ultimately. We have to go underground with it, and we have to wage our own shadow wars. We've done this in the Cold War. People talk about this like it's a new thing. No, it's not. In our lifetime, we've done this. Maybe we haven't done it well. I also talk very honest about this, like Guatemala 53, Iran 53. I don't know if you recall these things, but the CIA manipulated sort of coup d'etats. And that's a problem. And one of the problems that came out of the church committee of the 70s is that democracy and secrets are not compatible. So how do we wage a shadow war if we don't want to lose our democratic soul? Autocracies can do it very easily because Putin manipulates the press and everybody else. But we can't do that. But there are things that we can do shadow war against autocracies. Autocracies are also vulnerable to this type of manipulation. And I give some specific ideas in here on how to do that. Also, how do you delegitimize virulent and nasty ideologies? We can kill ISIS all day long, but their center of gravity is an ideology that we have to work with partners in the Middle East to debunk, and we have to be a little bit more creative. It's hard to imagine, like, how do we get, our strategic communication skills in this country are terrible, but we invented Hollywood and Madison Avenue. There's no excuse for it. So our government's just not very savvy about how to deploy it and how to work with the private sector. So there's a lot of other ideas in the book specifically. They're not just sort of hand waves, but I talk about creating an American Foreign Legion for zones of disorder. I talk about swapping the reserves and the active duty in the US military, because I think we've got the exact wrong proportions. I mean, there's a lot of specific ideas, enough to make the strategic culture of the Pentagon ears perk up.
I'll take a question just right in the front row. There's a microphone just coming up.
Question is really, how do you make things change the way you'd like them changed?
Yeah, so that's a dissertation level question. No, so like the first thing you've got to do is you got to point to what the change needs to be. So right now, it's easy to get mired into a discussion of authorities and legalities and how do we, and if you do that, then you'll see those give up and it'll be status quo. But it's amazing too that we have had some of these problems for a very long time. And there's some, I don't know, the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about, and to some extent Teddy Roosevelt did as well. How do you fix that? All I know is that, I think that Eisenhower and Senator McCain would be rolling in their graves right now if they saw the current, Secretary of Defense, right? So I don't know how to break that. Ultimately, it comes down to Congress, and who elects Congress is us. So I think one way to your latest question in the back is if everybody did serve, military or civilian, that might make people think more sincerely about how we wage war in the future, because right now there's not much skin in the game.
Take a question all the way in the back.
going back to Guatemala, I recall Kermit Roosevelt, I think, bought mullahs to help overthrow the presidency. And we've had no problems episodically overturning, as you mentioned, Guatemala, Mexico, any number of countries.
Yes.
The problem is we're not consistent in being bastards. And I think to a large degree what you're advocating is some consistency in having the same tools be used that the opponents do. And
Yes.
I recall that the CIA, those of us who read the 6 Days of the Condor, the CIA actually had an operation where they put disinformation on the Soviet grain harvest and create the impression of starvation. But they had to have a separate unit to then vet the information that came back from Soviet press to tell the internal echelon that, no, we put that rumor out. It's actually a false story. Isn't part of your answer here that we have to start doing, as you indicate in your 10 rules, exactly that which our opponents do and stomach the nausea and don't publicize it, frankly? But the same token, to overcome strategic atrophy, what exactly are the first few targets? You mentioned autocracies have vulnerabilities. What is a good use of the same tools against an autocracy like Putin?
Okay, that's great. Another very compound and complex question. I appreciate that. So 3 things. So first is that this book brackets the important question of ethics in war, right? That's a separate book. It doesn't ask, should we go to war? It takes it at the position that we're at war, we're going to go to war. How do we wage it as efficiently as possible to minimize loss of life and tragedy? And it's in this way, it's identical to, say, Clausewitz's On War or Sun Tzu's The Art of War. They don't get into the normative questions of should we go to war. It's not just war theory. It's we're going to go to war, we're in war. How do we do it as efficiently as possible without glorifying it? Second, one of the things I discuss at length, and to your question too, is we need a grand strategy. We have not had a grand strategy since the Berlin Wall fell down, since containment ended. We have been strategically adrift. I talk about what a grand strategy is, how you make it, what makes it grand, and why there's so much grand skepticism in Washington today about grand strategy. People are like, it can't be done. It can be done. We're just not thinking hard enough about it. This book also makes the point that we need to invest in gray matter more than silicon. So grand strategy would rationalize some of these things about racking and stacking threats and about how to go after them. And one of the rules on here is that the most effective weapons do not fire bullets. So rather than us looking at China and the South China Sea, rather than us trying to invest in more F-35s and more submarines and more aircraft carriers, which cost $13 billion a copy before sailors and aircraft are added, which do not deter a thing and do not really stop the Chinese at all, why don't we get savvy to the new rules of war? If you want to get China out of South China Sea, you don't take them on Cold War, like World War II style. What you do is you uphold the Uyghurs in the West. You focus on rivals within the sort of the Politburo of Beijing, stuff we used to do in the Cold War. You get them focused away from the South China Sea and at domestic issues, and that's one way to defang them. Are we prepared to do that as a nation? I don't know, but are we prepared to, have America kicked out of the South China Sea region? I'm not sure if that's any better. We'll have to microphone. I'll leave it to the
Yep, the microphone is just right next.
To Victoria to.
So one of the tools could be, rather than trying to ban oligarchs and restrict them, we co-opt them. We help a oligarch hedge fund, whatever it takes, to penetrate that level of Russian thinking.
There's a lot of, when I talk the shadow rule chapter here, I talk a lot of these things. And the question is, when you look at a strategy, a military or any sort of national security strategy, you have to look at least 2 things. One, is it feasible? Can it work? And 2, is it acceptable to the American people? But is it acceptable that we should not assume that we're going to be the unilateral superpower forever and ever. That's wrong. We have to be honest with ourselves about the world that we face ahead of us, because right now we've had a lot more threats than we did, say, 20 years ago. So I look at some of these things in the book.
We'll take a question right here in the white sweater.
I don't mean to be a contrarian, but
yes, please
isn't peace an option here? Isn't there something, I don't see how those rules end anywhere near peace.
Yes. So the truth is we are at peace with much of the world already. We're focusing on China, Russia, ISIS, North Korea, a couple of the main threats. And that's the focus of the book. Do we have to worry about France? Do we have to worry about other places in the world? Probably not. The other thing is, if you look at rule number 3, it's a mistake to look at war or peace. It's war and peace. And this is not new, because in the Cold War we had something very similar to this. It just requires some more nuanced thinking. Those who want, and I applaud it, that would love to have like peace and stability and rule of law, it's an admirable goal, and we should continue to seek it out. But I'm focusing on like the worst parts of the world. So it's not to exclude or say it's impossible that we can, why can't we have peace with Mexico? That's not the point. Yeah. Yes.
Yep.
So I destabilize your country.
Yeah.
And the durable war goes on.
Yeah.
Durable war means there's no durable peace.
Yeah.
Because I'm continuously destabilizing.
Sure.
How do you get to peace if you're continually destabilizing?
Well, that's a great question. It depends. When you look at this, you've said, what is war? How do you know what victory is in this scenario? Victory is, what are your political objectives that you set out at the beginning of the conflict? And do you achieve those or not? And you can't move the goalpost as politicians do, because history is never fooled, right? Now, rule number 10 is victory is fungible. What this means is that there's many ways to win and lose. In a conventional war, the only way to win is killing more enemy, taking more territory, flying your flag over the capital. That's not how it works anymore. Israel tried this against Hezbollah in 2006 and lost. Okay? Look at ISIS. I mean, we've done this all, and so we agree on this. So what is the political objectives you're trying to seek? And destabilizing places, can that achieve it? Well, maybe. I mean, maybe we can do that in a place where Russia's in, destabilize it for Russia, push Russia out, and then maybe foster a democracy, not like Iraq, different model. Maybe there can be an optimistic outcome. I don't want you to think that this is just like, we're going to be Dante-esque with this and make an inferno, and then at least the bad guy doesn't hold it. But it's a good question. And like the Italian wars and durable disorder, you have sort of perpetual conflict. Yeah.
We'll take a question from our student group.
Thank you. Hi. With the threat of nuclear war, how could a nuclear attack, either from North Korea onto the U.S. or the U.S. onto another state, change the global rules of war again? And moreover, how could the U.S. utilize the new rules of war to combat or prevent a nuclear attack?
So nuclear weapons is interesting because it also destroys conventional war. And thinkers in the 1950s, especially Rand and game theory, explore all this. The thing about nuclear war is that, we should not assume the nuclear taboo is going to last forever. I think there's a good chance we'll see a nuclear bomb go off in somebody's lifetime in this room. Also, this idea of, can there be a limited nuclear war? I'm thinking India versus Pakistan right now. I'm thinking of a scenario where India invades Pakistan and Pakistan uses a nuke on its own territory. Right? How would the world respond? Of course, it would open up a floodgate to using nuclear weapons, and people will view it like a big bomb. I think one way to not think about it is sort of the 1960s mutually assured destruction. That might happen, but it might not either. Also, we have things like the JDAM bomb, which is pretty darn big. So sometimes it's funny what we privilege as what's a weapon system, what versus not. But I am fearful of seeing limited nuclear war in our lifetime.
Take a question all the way in the back right here.
So, I come from India, now live in the US, both open societies and the use of the internet to, change minds, create havoc. And what's the solution? I mean, there doesn't seem to be any solution for random mayhem in the marketplace or a synagogue or attacking
Yes. So I discussed this again in rule number 9. I'll talk about how open societies are vulnerable to this way of warfare, all right? And we don't want to become a closed society, right? And this is traditionally what happens to democracies in wars. When democracies fight wars, they become more autocratic, and it goes back to Athens, the Peloponnesian War, and Thucydides. This is not new. Look at the U.S. during the Civil War, during Abraham Lincoln. As brilliant as he was a strategist, how it became more autocratic. So I think one of the things we have to do is, how do we create savvier consumers of information? I don't know how to do that, but we need that. Also, I think rule number 2 here is technology will not save us. This is really about like the F-35 and our huge investments in these types of old rules of war technology. But we do need technology. We need technology that helps us become better consumers of information. So if you see clickbait, if we have a technology that says, this is made in North Korea, you wouldn't click it, right? So we need more technologies like that and less technologies about, how to defeat battlefield tactical environment things. So, but they're also, let's not forget that autocracies are also vulnerable, but in different ways, to this modern way of warfare. It's not just purely a one-way street against democracy, and sometimes the best defense can be an offense.
Gentleman in the gray jacket.
Thank you. You talked a little bit about the F-35 and the huge, if I may say, waste of money on something that's not particularly useful, but is presumably very, very popular with Lockheed and all of the other contractors because it makes such a large amount of money. Similarly, I think you've talked about how private military companies don't produce conclusive solutions to problems. In fact, they serve to prolong them because they're not trying to win, they're trying to continue getting paid. So my question is, can you maybe talk about how maybe profit-seeking entities are an obstacle to American interests, maybe that in a way they're not obstacles to Russian or Chinese interests, and is there a way to sidestep that?
So it's a great question. And so this is going back to Eisenhower and Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt. The whole public-private partnership is both highly useful, but also has issues that how do you use private means to achieve public sector interests, and can they work at cross purposes? And I wrote a book before this, a nonfiction book called The Modern Mercenary. It's an Oxford University Press book that talks about all the ways that some companies, not all, some companies can manipulate information, asymmetries of information to better serve their interests at the expense of their clients' interests. And this was a big issue during Machiavelli's time. And he couldn't figure it out, and nobody else could either. And I am pessimistic about what happens when we marketize warfare, because that's what's going on right now. War is becoming increasingly marketized, and I'm not talking about the US, I'm talking about like UAE. It's a lot of money to throw around. And they're creating a market for force there that could blow back through other parts of the world. And so this is, Cicero said, war is fueled by the sinews of money. I mean, this is an old problem, and I don't have a great pat solution to it. But we have to be made aware of it. And it's not just the F-35, it's much bigger than that now.
Okay, we'll take a question just up here. Microphone's coming.
Try to narrow this down a little bit. So conventional war.
Yes.
We look at World War II. Everyone understood what Hitler was trying to do: Lebensraum, domination, so on. So what do you think China's end game is?
China, I think, they have a greater Han dynasty, and I mean, everybody who talks about greater China, greater Russia, greater Germany, it should be a red flag to everybody. I mean, Russia, I think Putin has a czarist-like vision. Erdogan has an Ottoman-like vision, Sultan vision. I think China has a similar vision where they have their own Monroe Doctrine, and they want to push us out. And they actually have this thing called the three warfare strategy about how to do this, which I discussed in this book. But the three warfares are these, and it's working. One is information/influence. Another is lawfare, manipulating international law, twisting, perverting it to serve their interests. And the third is using like market forces. And look at how they, like Tony Soprano, they took over a huge port in Sri Lanka, right? This is how they're winning the world. And they're not, what's absent? Military force, right? They're playing by the new rules of war. We're stuck in World War II. But yeah, and so I think that they, and you don't have to be wealthy, or you don't have to, there's a lot of ways to play this, but that their interest, I think, is this hegemony. Like, they want to become regional hegemony, and maybe someday the world's hegemon.
Great. There's a hand up just in the back. Yep, just behind you.
How does cyber warfare, malware, viruses play into this? Because that seems like a much greater bomb than a nuclear, which would create the, the nuclear winter and all the things you and I probably both studied.
So I add a little discipline to the cyber debate. So every time you hear someone talk about cyber, not you, it's like it's jazz hands. Like, oh my God, they're going to take down all the electricity, and they've been saying that for 20 years now. If you look at the studies, rodents are a bigger threat to our electrical grid than cyber. I mean, the squirrel is this true enemy of our power grid. But this is the cyber has become like these sprinkle like fairy dust on any, like, not you, but people have these pet projects. They want to better this, they want to better that. But if you use the word cyber in it, like somehow DoD is going to throw you money, and they probably will. So unfortunately, the signal to noise ratio in the cyber debate is way out of whack. Where cyber is important, it's not sabotage. So you remember Stuxnet, like a couple years ago? That was nonsense. That did not slow down the Iranian nuclear program at all, which is why, in part, the Obama administration tried to have a nuclear deal with Iran. The real power of cyber is influence. It's influence. And all cyber does, it allows us to do old things in new ways. It allows us to do theft, propaganda, espionage, and some sabotage. But I think cyber is obviously very important, because I think in the future, war is becoming more epistemological. It's, the winners and losers will be determined by who can figure out truth from lies. And cyber has it's both a weapon and a defense in that war.
Like Brexit or the elections?
Yes. So I think Brexit elections that's a true power of cyber. It's not Stuxnet.
All right, we're going to try to take 2 more questions. So the lady in the green. Yep.
I'll try to answer quickly.
So adding to that, could you just quickly comment on germ warfare?
Oh, well, I'm against it. No, look, germ warfare, I mean, the thing that concerns all of us is like suicide terrorist groups, suicide cults, because no rational actor would use germ warfare because it can mutate against you, right? But during that said, during the 1980s, the U.S. invested in huge germ warfare programs that were designed to take out entire countries. I mean, it's really lethal and abhorrent. I hope that some suicide cult does not invest in this. But I don't, I don't know. I don't know how hard it is to create those types of germs if it's really expensive, because there are cheaper ways to do harm in the world. So how do you I mean, to be very, I know we have another question, but so yeah, I hopefully won't see it. Not the main focus of the book. Yeah.
Well, we'll take a question right here.
Going back to your original explanation of how we got into the durable disorder, to what extent is the United Nations culpable for creating a situation that enables countries like Russia and China to employ the tactics they're employing right now?
Yeah, well, I think Russia and China, I think the United Nations will be basically, it's impotent right now. I mean, if you look at the Crimea, if you look at the Middle East, I mean, the UN's role, if you look at, we don't have time for the history of the UN, but there's a pre-Cold War UN, there's post-Cold War UN, the failures of the Balkans, the failures of Rwanda, and now the Chapter 7 missions and R2P, and I think nobody takes the UN seriously anymore. That maybe for certain things like climate change, they can be a great actor, but in terms of mitigating armed conflict, and their initial mission was to stop a World War III in Europe. And that way they were successful. But I'm pessimistic in them being able to control and mitigate. And I spent a lot of time with the UN in Africa. And if you look at Darfur, if you look at the Congo, there's not many success stories to be told there.
And actually, we have 1 minute left, so I will take one more question. The gentleman with his raised hand.
So in this new context, how do you see the future of international coalition when we see the result of Libya or Afghanistan and Iraq?
So I think international coalitions are important, but why do we limit them just to states? We live in a post-Westphalian era where Fortune 500 companies are more powerful than most states in the world. So why don't we have a more complex and robust form of coalitions, and it's not just purely like Napoleonic state-on-state diplomacy and warfare. And that's what this book argues for. It's a much more nuanced vision of international relations.
Great. Well, that's all the time that we have. Sean McFate's book is for sale. It's going to touch on all this and many more. So please join me in thanking Sean.